beautiful homemakers. Today I will be reading a short story from Grace Livingston Hill, written in 1895, called John Chamberlain's Easter Coat. It was Monday morning, and the world had put on its workaday clothes again and started the busy song of the week. Even the lazy clouds, which but the day before had been still and dreamy in their Sunday quiet, seemed to be scurrying across the sky with a purpose. The whiz and whir of machinery from the tannery and sawmill across the river could be heard distinctly. Everything seemed to be bustling about to get ready for spring to come. The withered grass, amid patches of dirty, discouraged-looking snow that seemed about ready to take its departure, spruced up a little, and actually tried to send forth a faint green tinge in response to the warm sunlight. A young man, a salesman perhaps, walked briskly down the street of the little village toward the two stores, with a large valise in his hand. He had a business air, even to the slightest detail of his dress. His nicely fitting clothes reminded one of the bustling city. But despite all the atmosphere of hurry that hung over the place, John Chamberlain still stood at his front gate. He was watching the young man, presumably a salesman, as he hastened down the street. It was not so much the man, either, that his eyes were fixed upon, as it was his clothes. Anyone could tell by a glance at those clothes that they were made by a city tailor, and they gave their wearer an air of grace and importance which John Chamberlain's clothes had never afforded. He knew the lines of that coat on the young man almost as well as his own, for he had studied their shape with careful eye during the whole of the sermon yesterday morning, envying the turn of the collar, and even the two jaunty buttons set behind. He looked down again at his own coat as the other disappeared within a store at the end of the street. What was it but an ungainly covering which always made him feel that his hands were encumbrances which were to be got along with the best way he could, that his joints were made of wood and would not move at his bidding, and that his whole figure was utterly out of proportion in every direction. He wished he could have a coat made by a real city tailor himself. He had never had one. Money was scarce. He despised these cheap ready-made affairs he had worn since he had grown too old for his mother to make his clothes. He took out his knife and cut spiteful little chips out of the fence post. Why should that fellow, meaning of course the salesman, wear such coats with that insolent, easy way, and he, John Chamberlain, have to wear these nasty store-made things that he despised? He had been given a good education, if he was poor, and the salesman did not look as if he had any brains worth mentioning. Yet Jessie had cast actual glances of admiration in his direction after church, and asked who he was. Of course, the admiration was for the coat. Jessie was a stylish, trim little thing. Here his face grew tender as the vision of the slender, dainty, bright-faced girl came before him. Jessie, who always seemed to be able to make a pretty costume out of almost nothing. Her clothes, nevertheless, made her look utterly unlike any of the other girls of the village, and set her well above them so far as style, though the others tried hard to eclipse her. His heart rebelled against a fact that kept him from having a coat that would merit admiration from Jessie. He felt sure he would be able to walk up the church aisle with as much nonchalance as the young stranger, if he could wear the stranger's clothes and not let his hands and feet get in the way. There was much nicking of the fence post done that morning. for John Chamberlain was deciding an important question. But it was settled at last, and he started for his work. He walked down the street briskly, too, now. He had decided to have a new coat, and once decided, it was almost as good as having it on his back that minute. Why, there was the entire variety of coats to choose from. Prince Albert's, sack coats, business coats, and the whole world of coats. An evening suit even hovered dimly on the horizon of his mind, without any shadow of an idea of coming nearer to him, however. But it was pleasant to him to think of it as a possibility. He walked down that street in all the glory of the best-fitting clothes that the finest city tailor could make. His arms swung easily at his sides, and he was for once utterly unconscious of the red, bony appendages which he used for hands, and which had hitherto troubled him so much. Imagination can do a great deal. It even went so far as to make him raise his arm, covered at that moment with the prospective Prince Albert sleeve, which was to be bound with braid and finished with 2 small neat buttons, and touch his hat with as much grace of movement as a city salesman could possibly use, to Jessie as he passed her house. And she thought, as she blushingly returned the salute, "What a fine figure John has! Strange I never noticed before how handsome he is growing. If he was going to have the coat, he might as well have it at once," he thought. In 2 weeks it would be the Easter vacation. Jessie's 2 brothers would be at home then for a few days, and she had said she wanted to have a little gathering for them. It would be very nice to have something new for that time. Indeed, now he thought of it, it was absolutely necessary that he have it for church on Easter Sunday. Why, it would be very embarrassing to have to attend church under the eyes of those college brothers with his old ill-shaped coat. It certainly would not do. He would go down to the city the very next day and have his measurements taken, that the new one might be ready in time. This much settled, he went to his work with a light heart, and whistling a joyous tune. All day long, as he went about his duties, he saw himself as he would appear in the new garment. He felt the pleasure with which he would enter the church. It would be an unusual time, anyway. The church would be trimmed, and all the ladies would have their spring bonnets. John had a dim idea that a new bonnet was in some way connected with Easter time. And if bonnets, why not coats? Of course he must look his best. He would feel that he fitted in with the flowers and the extra music and all the gala attire, if he had his new coat. But about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that most marvelous of all the proofs that God has given us of his love and mercy, that wonderful story which makes us sure that we shall never die, John thought not one whit that day. Easter to him was a time of wearing new clothes, a time of the return of college brothers, a time of enjoyment that held all sorts of delightful possibilities for him. Not that he was not a Christian, this young man whose heart at that present moment seemed to be given over to dress. Why, he was to lead the young people's prayer meeting on that eventful Easter Sunday night. But he had forgotten about that entirely. When it did again enter his consciousness, it looked to him like a tremendous cross, especially under the existing circumstances of possibly sarcastic college brothers, which must be taken up and carried in the easiest way. Nevertheless, it would be easier if carried on the shoulders of a new coat. He could even think of himself quite composedly as standing up before the desk in his new coat announcing a hymn. On the whole, that meeting had a pleasant side to it, for after the cross had been borne and the meeting was over, he might persuade Jessie to let him walk home with her. And perhaps if the evening was pleasant, and the moonlight bright, she would not mind walking on up the hill a little way. And then, perhaps, it might be that he would feel the time had come to say something to Jessie which he had long wanted to say. It would all depend upon the effect of the new coat. So the young fellow worked and whistled away and thought his pleasant thoughts, and the night at last came when he could dream them all over again. And then the morning, with an early breakfast and a rush for the fast express that would take him to the city in an hour and a half. Then began a day for John. He had not imagined it would be so hard a task to do his shopping. He went from tailor to tailor, seeking exactly the coat of his ideal. But it proved hard to find, at least for the price he could afford to pay. For this young fellow had extravagant tastes, although he did not know it. They showed him one after another and tried to make him think he would have a ready-made one, but he was firm. A coat made to order he would have and no other. And at last, after weary searchings, he found the right piece of cloth, corresponding both to the size of his purse and his taste. It was with pride that he doffed his old coat that his measurements might be taken, and he drew his fine proportions up to their full height and looked down upon himself as the tape measure went grimly around his chest. Soon he would have a coat that he could be proud of, and this tape measure was its harbinger, and therefore a badge of honor. Of course, he did not really think all this, or at least did not realize that he was doing so, for John was a young man of too good sense to have said all this to himself. But there was the pleasant sensation of it in his soul, which made him lean back in his seat in the homeward-bound evening train and actually enjoy his ride home, weary though he was with his shopping. With thoughts of himself in his new attire, John's days dragged slowly by until it should be done. And as the important Sunday drew near, he began to be anxious lest it would not be done in time. But the coat arrived from the tailor's, and Jessie's brothers from their college, on the same train on Saturday evening. John met them both at the station, a little chagrined, it is true, that he had to wear his old coat. But it was dark, and he kept well in the shadow. Besides, he felt a sort of gentle, stylish influence from the bundle under his arm, even through its several heavy wrappings. With the knowledge of what was inside that brown paper, he could walk easily beside even college-bred young men. They beguiled him into a scheme for the evening, the brothers and Jessie, and he came home rather late, the precious package still unwrapped, only to remember as he entered his room that he was the leader of the meeting for the following evening, and that he had not prepared for it in the slightest degree. He took down his Bible and tried to make some little preparation then, but his eyes were heavy, and he soon gave it up. He had to have one look at his coat before his head touched the pillow. He untied the strings and drew it from the paper. But just as he held it at arm's length and shook out the folds, his kerosene lamp, which his landlady did not believe in filling very often, flickered and sputtered, and its gasping flame sank lower and lower. He turned it up impatiently and tried to look again closely at the coat. But the flickering flame winked lugubriously and gave warning that it would last but a moment more, and he had better hasten to his bed, or he would be left in utter darkness to make his final preparations. He laid the coat carefully on his chair, and made all haste to obey, feeling it a little hard that he should be thus prevented from a scrutinizing view of this long-awaited garment. But he smiled as he turned out the light of the wicked smoking lamp, and said to himself, "Never mind, it will be there in the morning. I can wait, and I'll enjoy it all the better then." Then he went to sleep to dream of the pleasant evening he had passed, and of the morrow that might be so full of joy for him. It was late when he awoke the next morning. The first early church bell was actually ringing. He sprang up and dressed hastily, not caring to put on the new apparel until after he had been down to breakfast. Back in his room, he hastened at last to the coat. There it lay in all the glory of its newness and its supposed city fit. Its color was so very black, and its buttons so very precise and trim, that he felt like apologizing for the blacking on his boots, brushed to a high polish though it was. On went the coat, for there really was not much time left for admiration, if one was to get to the church before the whole congregation was seated. He buttoned the last button proudly, and stepped to the glass to survey himself. Oh, horror of horrors! What was this? A cold chill began to creep upward, and a heavy feeling replaced his happiness. Could it be that it did not fit? What? A city coat not fit? A coat cut by a city tailor not fit? Why, no one ever heard of such a thing. There must be some mistake. He must have put it on wrong in some way. He gave it a decided yank upward, and then smoothed it over his shoulders with both hands, as a lady does with an ill-fitting dress, and then squared about again in defiance to the glass. But no, the collar sagged down in the back with the same dogged air as before. With despair, he seized hold of the shoulders of the innocent thing and gave it such a jerk toward his ears as could not fail to bring about a decided change in the set of the article. But the more fiercely he pulled and smoothed and raised his shoulders and ducked his head forward in his attempts, the more determined that collar grew to lop out and away from the shining linen it was meant to cover. The linen collar creaked and squeaked, the shirt bosom groaned, the necktie writhed itself till the bow was under one ear, but all to no purpose. Disappointment was no name for the feeling in John's heart. He had not realized how thoroughly he had come to depend upon this new coat, nor how much his heart had been set upon it. If he had been a girl, he would have cried, but being a man, he did not understand himself, and his face grew red, and he tore around his room and glared at his crooked, cracked looking-glass. To add to his confusion, the second bell for church began to ring, and soon he knew it would toll. He tried to calm himself, for certainly this coat must be worn to church if he went at all. It would not do to wear the old one after all the abuse he had heaped upon it during the week. He tried another collar, not quite so high, and then one higher, and a darker necktie too. But all seemed to make no difference. He brushed his hair over again savagely 2 or 3 times, but still his head continued to look as if it were going on ahead of him, with that coat collar like a rudder steering him. At last the bell was almost done tolling. He seized his hat and rushed down the street to the church, arriving there out of breath, just as the choir began the opening anthem. John Chamberlain thought as he entered the church and searched about for a seat, and none was to be found, that the eyes of the whole congregation were upon him and his coat collar. If he had seen the tailor who made it, I am not sure but he would have strangled him then and there. He remembered with mortification the delight with which he had contemplated himself in his mind's eye in this very coat. And now the reality was causing him more embarrassment than he had known in all the time he had owned his old one. Why, he had been well pleased with that when it was new. He had not expected anything better of it than to cover him and to look clean and new. He realized with a sense of pain that this one best coat of his, which was to him so much, had just been a common, everyday affair to the tailor who made hundreds of them for common use by the city people. His painful thoughts were interrupted by hearing the announcement of the young people's meeting that evening, and he experienced that sudden, awful feeling that he was rushing on to a moment for which he was not prepared, and for which he seemed to have lost all power to prepare. But there did come a calm in his whirl of thoughts. It was during the singing, "I know that my Redeemer lives." The triumphant melody floated over the church, and John Chamberlain could but listen, for it was as if angels had charge of that music, and were wafting it to hearts, and not alone to ears. He did not understand why the thought that his Redeemer had risen thrilled him just then, as it had never done before. Perhaps it was because the dear Lord was present there, ready to come to each troubled or doubting heart, even to John Chamberlain, sitting there in his new disappointing coat, in the back seat, with his head bowed. Surely he did come and bless that heart, for John felt a peace which he had not known before. It did not come from the sermon, for that was not so very wonderful, though John thought it was. But it must have been from the Master himself, for it stayed with him. John could not have told much of the sermon when it was over. Indeed, he felt very uncertain about the text. He only knew that he had been with the disciples as they took the body of Jesus from the cross and prepared it for the burial. He fancied he himself had helped to pour out the precious spices. He felt the sorrow in his heart all the while that the disciples must have felt when they thought they were doing the last bit of service for their Master. And then he seemed to have stood afar off and watched the stone as it was rolled to the opening in the tomb, and a great seal set upon it. It was all very vivid to him. He was certain he knew how the disciples felt when the angels spoke to them, for the angels seemed to have spoken to him and said, "Fear not, for he is risen." And after that, he seemed to have talked with the Master himself. The prayer which followed the sermon seemed to John to be conversation with a risen, present Savior, and not a talk addressed to a God afar off, as prayer usually seemed to him. He had forgotten his coat utterly. He was uplifted. Jessie noticed him as he sat listening with earnest, attentive gaze to the speaker. John was a handsome man, she thought, as she turned back to listen herself and see what it was in which he appeared to be so much interested. She had not seen the ill fit of the coat collar, and was not sufficiently versed in coats to know that it was wrong if she had. John looked nice in her eyes, and she was glad. Instead of going to walk, as was John's custom on Sunday afternoons, and dropping in at Jessie's house, perhaps, he stayed in his room. He felt that he had much to think about and must be by himself. There was the meeting. It could not be passed by easily. After the impression the morning sermon made upon his heart, he did not dare to stand up there and lead the meeting in a perfunctory manner as he ordinarily did when it came his turn, without saying one word upon the subject himself, nor even leading in prayer, but rather calling upon someone else to do it for him, and shirking every possible duty that he could. For a little while that afternoon he felt that he must go to someone and say that he could not lead that meeting. He felt so unworthy. But the same spirit that had been with him in the morning led him to a different frame of mind, until he was willing to kneel down and say, "Here, Lord, am I, unworthy though I am. Make me useful as thou wilt." The new coat hung carelessly over a chair, forgotten, while the owner studied his Bible. When John Chamberlain once more donned his proud apparel, there was indeed a slight feeling of regret and disappointed hopes connected with it. But it seemed of very little consequence now, in the light of the last few hours. One glance he gave at himself in the glass just before he left the room, and really the collar was not quite so bad after all, but lay almost meekly about his neck. He went down the street clothed not in fine raiment, as he had hoped to be, but in the quiet garment of humility. One thought was in his mind now, not of earthly apparel, but of spiritual. An old thought, which Paul expressed in these words, "For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house which is from heaven, that mortality might be swallowed up of life. Now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept." He could almost hear the words of the morning song echoing yet in his heart, and it brought new meaning to him now as he realized that he, too, would one day arise to be with Christ forever. Over and over in his mind ran the words, as he took that walk in the starlight while the bells chimed in their joyful resurrection carols. "So when this corruptible shall have put on incorruption, and this mortal shall have put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory." John and Jessie took that walk together after the service, just as he had thought they might. She had meant to stop at her own gate, of course. When they reached it, John had been talking so earnestly about the meeting, and there had been such a longing in her own heart not to have the talk end, that she had yielded when he held her arm a little more firmly and said, "Just let us walk a little farther, Jessie. I'm not half through talking yet." On they walked, not heeding how far after that, out where the road melted into still green fields, with mossy, sleepy-looking fences on either side, but where the soft gray clouds sweep overhead and do not look, and even the little trees by the roadside are asleep and cannot hear. They had many things to talk about, for the meeting had been a very helpful one, and this was a resurrection day to these two hearts in more ways than one. Jessie felt how cold-hearted a Christian she had been for a long time, and she told John she meant to be different now, that he had helped her to some new thoughts which she would never forget, and that Christ was more to her than he had ever been before. And John felt his heart throb with joy and gratitude, that though he was unworthy, he had been used by the Master so soon. Yes, and he did speak those words he had thought so long to speak, all unfitting as his coat collar was. I am not sure, though, that he would have dared to do so even in the glories of the salesman's stylish suit, if a cloud had not covered the moon often that night, and if his heart had not been so warm and happy about other things, that such small, insignificant objects as coats vanished into oblivion. In due course of time, when the pain of the disappointment had disappeared, John told Jessie all about it, and she laughed with him and cried about it too, for her true woman's heart saw between his comical sentences the keen disappointment he must have felt over the failure of his first dress-up coat to be all he had planned it should be. But when the laugh was over, and they were quietly and soberly talking about it, she said, "John, I'm glad it didn't fit after all, for then you might have been complacent and never come to have that wonderful feeling about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which filled you so full that it reached even to me." Dress is one of the things that leads people away from Christ. It must be one of the greatest things he meant when he said, "Come out from among them and be ye separate." It always did seem dreadful to me to talk about Easter bonnets as if they had any connection with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Easter coats are not any worse than Easter bonnets, John, but I'm glad it didn't fit. The end. I hope you enjoyed that. Bye.